Well, it comes definitely to technology and using technology to provide information to communities. And I think there are, with seemingly greater frequency, events that are beyond the capacity of governments and their emergency services to respond. And the critical factor that determines loss of life and property will be the information, the warnings, etc., that are communicated to a threatened community, whether it's Japan and tsunami and earthquakes, or whether it's earthquakes in Christchurch, bushfires, floods, cyclones in Australia. We've had what seems to be an increasing frequency of larger scale events. Now, whether that's climate change caused or not is a subject for another day. But the facts are we need people to have information, but we need them to be able to know what to do with that information when they get it.
So for the first point, we need people to have information. Specifically, what can we do better about enabling them to get it?
Well, I think it's an embarrassment for Australia that it took Black Saturday to actually create the space where the various jurisdictions came together and agreed to use telephony as a primary platform to warn the public, to use your telephone, your landline or your mobile to actually provide crucial bits of information that might just give that little bit of extra time to take steps to protect yourself. Now, it seems to me as a country, there is so much technology available. There are so many things we could do if we worked with the private sector to understand what those technologies are and how they could be used.
Tell me a couple more of them.
Well, for example, I would argue that the best warning systems in the world will come to nothing if they're not fed by the best intelligence gathering systems. So just a simple example, social media at the moment is something that gets written up in every review, every inquiry that's into the events we seem to be having. And one of the recommendations is emergency services need to factor in social media into the way they push information out. I'd argue that we've got to take that a whole extra step and actually pull information back from communities about what's actually happening out in the community. So social media in my dream world or ideal world will become a two-way process, an opportunity to push information out through all sorts of different ways. And a classic for you is I saw a few years ago a couple of girls were exploring a drain in another state and there was a flash storm and the storm led to rapid water rises in the drain. Did they ring 000 for help? No. They used Facebook to get in contact with their friends who rang 000. Now, my initial response was probably typical of conservative emergency managers, how stupid are they? But the practical reality is that's what people are going to do. And we need to accept that and build it into our system.
I mean, one point that Bruce was addressing earlier was actually the need for private companies and the communities to be part of that source of information during times of crisis rather than relying on a certain agency, right? And why don't we use technology to that end? And we have some learnings, for instance, from what happened in Japan with the tsunami, whereby people were gathering, word of mouth, which ATM is actually working, which food market is still dispensing food and water, and they were together as ad hoc individuals inputting that into a Google map. And people were using their smartphones to look at that Google map and see, oh, there I can get some fresh water.
People think about emergency management and they think about fire trucks and flood boats and storms. The reality is it's a whole spectrum of things, from preventing and mitigating or lessening the effect of emergencies by good quality planning, its response, but then it's rebuilding and recovery after the event. And what I've seen so typically is situations where temporary communication processes and information channels are put in place for a community while the emergency is seen to be in its response phase. And then as soon as the response has moved up to the next valley or whatever it might be, those channels are stopped. And that's the very point when the community needs information about how to get help, what recovery support is going to be available to it. So I think there's that broader notion of using information and recognising that the communication needs extend way beyond when the fire's extinguished or the flood has subsided. That's probably a time when the community needs the information even more.
And an example of recovery, Peter, blaze aid.
I was more involved with flood aid and quake aid. Flood aid was a few guys who I know quickly on Twitter when the Queensland floods happened, that they actually realised that one of the things that you want is I need a bed or I need a room to stay because my house is flooded, whatever. So these guys just belted out a thing called flood aid in 2 days. And that was fantastic in terms of just connecting people peer-to-peer, no authority, anything. They just hacked it together, belted it out, it worked. And
sustainable communities, by definition, are resilient communities. They bounce back when something happens. They bounce back because they're given information, and I think that's the critical point that I would be seeing in 2020 is information will no longer be something that is locked away on a need-to-know basis. It will be something that's bravely shared. Giuliani did it after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Every day, 3-4 times a day, he would have his experts with him and he would run a press conference and he would have basically 4 key messages. This is what we're doing. This is what we want you to do. This is what we know. And the hard part for politicians, this is what we don't know. And he built trust. And the other thing he did was he had an incredible partnership with the private sector. So the line between government and private sector was almost non-existent. They were all part of managing the emergency.